2. The term resource-efficient goods and services means goods and services, a. that use fewer resources than competing goods and services to serve the same purposes or achieve the same or substantially similar result as such competing goods and services, and b. for which the negative environmental impacts across the full life cycle of such goods and services are minimized. Sec. 874. Pilot program to incentivize contracting with employee-owned businesses. A. Qualified business wholly owned through an employee stock ownership plan defined. The term qualified businesses wholly owned through an employee stock ownership plan means an S corporation, as defined in Section 1361, A.1 of the Internal Revenue Code of 1986, for which 100% of the outstanding stock is held through an employee stock ownership plan, as defined in Section 4975, E.7 of such code. B. Pilot program to use non-competitive procedures for certain follow-on contracts to qualified businesses wholly owned through an employee stock ownership plan. 1. Establishment. The Secretary of Defense may establish a pilot program to carry out the requirements of this section. 2. Follow-on contracts. Notwithstanding the requirements of Section 2304 of Title 10, United States Code, and with respect to a follow-on contract for the continued development, production, or provision of products or services that are the same as or substantially similar to the products or services procured by the Department of Defense under a prior contract held by a qualified business wholly owned through an employee stock ownership plan, the products or services to be procured under the follow-on contract may be procured by the Department of Defense through procedures other than competitive procedures if the performance of the qualified business wholly owned through an employee stock ownership plan on the prior contract was rated as satisfactory, or the equivalent, or better in the applicable past performance database. 3. Limitation. A qualified business wholly owned through an employee stock ownership plan may have a single opportunity for award of a sole source follow-on contract under this section, unless a senior contracting official, as defined in Section 1737 of Title 10, United States Code, approves a waiver of the requirements of this section. C. Verification and reporting of qualified businesses wholly owned through an employee stock ownership plan. Under a pilot program established under this section, the Secretary of Defense shall establish procedures: 1. For businesses to verify status as a qualified businesses wholly owned through an employee stock ownership plan for the purposes of this section by using existing federal reporting mechanisms. 2. For a qualified businesses wholly owned through an employee stock ownership plan to certify that not more than 50% of the amount paid under the contract will be expended on subcontracts, subject to such necessary and reasonable waivers as the Secretary may prescribe. And 3. To record information on each follow-on contract awarded under subsection B, including details relevant to the nature of such contract and the qualified business wholly owned through an employee stock ownership plan that received such contract, and to provide such information to the Comptroller General of the United States. D. Data 1. In general. If the Secretary of Defense establishes a pilot program under this section, the Secretary shall establish mechanisms to collect and analyze data on the pilot program for the purposes of a. Developing and sharing best practices relating to the pilot program, b. Providing information to leadership and the Congressional Defense Committees on the pilot program, including with respect to each qualified business wholly owned through an employee stock ownership plan that received a follow-on contract under this section, I. The size of such business, 2. Performance of the follow-on contract, and 3. Other information as determined necessary, and c. Providing information to leadership and the Congressional Defense Committees on policy issues related to the pilot program. 2. Limitation. The Secretary of Defense may not carry out the pilot program under this section before a. Completing a data collection and reporting strategy and plan to meet the requirements of this subsection, and b. Submitting the strategy and plan to the Congressional Defense Committees. E. Sunset. Any pilot program established under this section shall expire on the date that is 5 years after the date of the enactment of this Act. F. Comptroller General Report 1. In general, not later than 3 years after the date of the enactment of this Act, the Comptroller General of the United States shall submit to Congress a report on any individual and aggregate uses of the authority under a pilot program established under this section. 2. Elements. The report under paragraph 1 shall include the following elements: a. An assessment of the frequency and nature of the use of the authority under the pilot program. b. An assessment of the impact of the pilot program in supporting the national defense strategy required under Section 113(g) of Title 10, United States Code. c. the number of businesses that became qualified businesses wholly owned through an employee stock ownership plan in order to benefit from the pilot program and the factors that influenced that decision. D. Acquisition authorities that could incentivize businesses to become qualified businesses wholly owned through an employee stock ownership plan, including an extension of the pilot program. E. Any related matters the Controller General considers appropriate. Sec. 875. Guidance, training, and report on place of performance contract requirements. A. Guidance and training, not later than July 1, 2022. The Secretary of Defense shall 1. Issue guidance on covered contracts to ensure that, to the maximum extent practicable, the terms of such covered contract avoid specifying an unnecessarily restrictive place of performance for such covered contract, and 2. Implement any necessary training for appropriate individuals relating to the guidance required under paragraph 1. B. Report 1. In general, not later than July 1, 2022. The Secretary of Defense shall submit to the Congressional Defense Committees a report on covered contracts. 2. Elements. The report required under paragraph 1 shall include the following elements. A. A description of the criteria that is considered when the Secretary specifies a particular place of performance in a covered contract. B. The number of covered contracts awarded during each of fiscal years 2016 through 2020. C. An assessment of the extent to which revisions to guidance or regulations related to the use of covered contracts could improve the effectiveness and efficiency of the Department of Defense, including a description of such revisions. C. Covered contract defined in this section. The term covered contract means a contract for which the Secretary of Defense specifies the place of performance for such contract. Sec. 876. Notification of certain intergovernmental support agreements. A. Notification required. During fiscal years 2022 and 2023, not less than 60 days before entering into an intergovernmental support agreement under Section 2679 of Title 10, United States Code, that is an exception to the requirements of Chapter 85 of Title 41, United States Code, the Secretary concerned shall submit, in writing, to the Congressional Defense Committees a report including the following relating to such agreement. 1. The circumstances that resulted in the need to enter into an intergovernmental support agreement that included such exception. 2. The anticipated benefits of entering into such agreement that included such exception. 3. The anticipated impact